She arrived to close a $900 million deal. But what she didn't expect was to be mocked like a maid in front of the elite. The insult was sharp, public, and racially charged. What came next shook the business world to its core. When Danielle Moore, the poised and brilliant CEO of one of the most influential tech firms in America, stepped out of her sleek black sedan and into the marble-clad entry of the Kingsley estate, she was there to finalize a historic partnership. The $900 million deal, with the Kingsley family a lineage of old money and polished power, was more than just business. It was symbolic. Danielle, a black woman who had climbed every rung with grit and grace, stood on the brink of redefining corporate leadership. But as she entered the banquet hall in her tailored navy suit, the air shifted. Eyes turned. Whispers swirled. And then came the voice dripping with condescension and cruelty. "Did someone mix up and bring the help in early?" sneered Brandon Kingsley, the smug son of the family patriarch. A few uneasy chuckles scattered across the room. No one, not even his father, Charles Kingsley, who stood nearby, intervened. Danielle stood still, her heart pounding, but her face composed. Though her dessert remained untouched, she quietly excused herself and left the table. She hadn't come to be tolerated. She had come to lead. And while others saw her skin, her gender, her presence as novelty, Danielle knew her worth. That insult wouldn't be forgotten, but neither would the storm it was about to awaken. Danielle Moore didn't slam the door on her way out. She didn't shout. She didn't curse. No. Her heels clicked calmly across the marble floor of the Kingsley estate, each step echoing louder than the laughter that had pierced her dignity moments earlier. Behind her, the ballroom was silent now, not because the crowd had found their decency, but because they didn't know how to react. A powerful black woman, one of the most accomplished CEOs in the country, had just been publicly humiliated, and no one had spoken up. Danielle's quiet exit wasn't a retreat. It was a declaration. And while Brandon Kingsley drunk on his family's power and champagne smirked with smug satisfaction, he had no idea that the real power had just walked out the front door. Outside, the crisp California night air offered no warmth, but it brought clarity. Danielle drew in a deep, steady breath, letting it fill her chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the door handle of her Carnot, from fear, but from the effort it took to keep her composure from cracking. She wasn't just angry, she was hurt. Hurt that after decades of breaking barriers and building her empire from nothing, she could still be reduced by one man's cruel joke to the help. And more than that, she was furious that Charles Kingsley, the elder patriarch, had stood in silence, letting his son's venom hang in the air, like cigar smoke foul and lingering. As the car pulled away from the estate, the taillights faded into the Beverly Hills hills like a final punctuation mark. Back at the party, Brandon laughed as if he'd won something. But what he didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Danielle hadn't left in defeat. She left to take control. That night in her high-rise apartment overlooking downtown Los Angeles, Danielle sat alone by the window, the city lights flickering like questions with no answers. Her phone buzzed with messages from board members. Some confused, some concerned. A few blunt, "Please don't let personal feelings ruin the deal." She stared at the screen, jaw tight. Was she supposed to swallow the insult and smile, shake hands with the very people who looked at her and saw a servant in a power suit? She thought back to that room, the way the women had whispered, the way the men had chuckled nervously, how no one had dared meet her eyes after Brandon's words landed. She thought of the little girl she once was, sitting on the steps of her mother's apartment building in Baltimore, dreaming of skyscrapers and boardrooms. Would that little girl be proud if she stayed quiet now, all for the sake of a contract? Danielle rose and walked to her desk, where the neatly printed contract for the Kingsley merger lay waiting. $900 million. It could revolutionize her company's future, expand their global presence. But at what cost? Her mind flashed back to Brandon's face, the smirk, the disdain, and her stomach turned. The next morning, Danielle arrived at her company's headquarters before sunrise. The boardroom filled quickly. Tension was thick. Every executive in the room knew what had happened the night before, but no one dared say it aloud. She stood at the head of the table, eyes sweeping across the anxious faces of those she had led for years. Some hoped she'd bury her pride and move forward. Others silently admired her strength, unsure whether to voice their support. Danielle didn't waver. "I know what you're all thinking," she began. "This deal was supposed to be transformative. But I will not transform into someone who trades dignity for dollars. We will not do business with people who believe skin color is a punchline." A hush swept over the room. "I walked away last night," she continued, her voice calm but razor sharp, "not because I was afraid, but because I refuse to share a table with those who see me as less than human." The room sat in stunned silence. Even the dissenters couldn't deny the power of her conviction. Danielle had done what few leaders dared. She put principle before profit. And in doing so, she sparked a shift not just within the walls of her company, but across an entire industry watching closely. By the time Danielle returned to her office, emails from news outlets and investors were already flooding in. Word was spreading fast, and the world was about to learn that the Kingsleys hadn't just lost a Dell, they had triggered a movement. Because Danielle Moore wasn't walking away empty-handed. She was walking away with her self-respect and the thunder of 1,000 quiet footsteps ready to follow. Danielle Moore stood alone in the pre-dawn stillness of her office, the horizon barely tinged with the promise of sunrise. Her tailored blazer lay neatly folded over the back of her chair, her hands resting on the edge of the conference table, empty now, but not for long. Within the hour, the boardroom would be filled with anxious faces, each one waiting to see if their CEO would cave to pressure or double down on her stance. The stakes were astronomical. A $900 million deal, market expectations, investor confidence. But to Danielle, the true cost had already been revealed. No contract, no matter how lucrative, could ever be worth the price of silence in the face of humiliation. The events of the previous night played on loop in her mind, Brandon Kingsley's arrogant smirk. The cruel joke he'd delivered with casual ease, the way his champagne flute glinted under the chandelier as he dismissed her humanity with a laugh. And worse, the silence. The silence from his father, Charles Kingsley, a man who had extended his hand in partnership mere weeks earlier, but hadn't lifted a finger to stop his son's insult. That silence spoke louder than the joke. It was a cold endorsement, a declaration that their wealth shielded them from accountability. By 7:00 a.m., the boardroom was full. Danielle entered with a presence that silenced every whisper. Her calm was not fragile. It was forged the quiet of someone who had been preparing for battles like this her entire life. She stood at the head of the table, greeted each executive with a nod, and allowed a few seconds of silence to settle before she spoke. "You all know what happened last night," she began, voice steady. "I was invited into a home as a business partner and treated like a maid." Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others lowered their eyes. No one interrupted. "I know this deal means a great deal to our projections. I know investors are watching. But let me make this clear. We are not proceeding with the Kingsley partnership." Gasps. A few stunned exclamations. Peter Lang, the company's CFO, stood up, face tight with urgency. "Danielle, I respect what you're saying, but this isn't just personnel, it's financial. You're talking about walking away from nearly $1 billion. "I am," she said plainly. "And he'll do it every time if that money comes attached to bigotry." Margaret Lewis, one of the oldest board members, chimed in her tone, laced with irritation. You're letting emotion dictate business. They can issue a public apology. That should be more than enough. Danielle met her gaze. Is an apology enough to erase what every woman of color in that room felt when no one stood up for me? Is it enough to tell the next generation of leaders that they should swallow abuse for a seat at the table? Her words hung in the air like thunderclouds, dense and undeniable. Peter tried again, more quietly now. What about our shareholders? If the stock tanks, how do we explain this? Danielle turned toward the large window behind her, then slowly back to the room. We tell them the truth, that we are a company built on integrity, not convenience, that we refuse to profit off partnerships that demean human dignity, that we measure success not just by how high our shares rise, but by how firmly we stand when tested. Silence followed. But this time it wasn't resistance, it was reflection. Across town in his private office at the Kingsley estate, Brandon scrolled through his phone with a smug grin, watching the corporate headlines buzz with speculation about the broken deal. To him, Danielle's departure had been a power play, one he assumed would end with her forced return. But what he failed to see was that he hadn't just lost a business deal. He had triggered a reckoning. Back in the boardroom, Danielle delivered the final blow with quiet finality. As the leader of this company, I am officially withdrawing from the Kingsley agreement. This decision is mine, and I accept full responsibility for its consequences. She closed her folder, lifted her chin, and walked out, leaving behind a boardroom full of executives who had just witnessed what real leadership looked like. Danielle didn't pause for applause. She didn't need a standing ovation. What she carried with her that morning was heavier and far more powerful than any contract. It was principle, and it would change everything. Danielle Moore barely had time to settle into her office before her phone exploded with notifications. Calls from investors, emails from reporters, urgent meeting requests. But it wasn't just her decision to walk away from the Kingsley deal that had the business world in an uproar. It was the viral storm brewing just outside the glass towers of corporate America. Overnight, a 2-minute video had surfaced online. Shot discreetly, likely by a server at the Kingsley mansion, the clip captured Brandon Kingsley, champagne flute in hand, delivering his racist insult in high definition. Did someone mix up and bring the help in early? The camera had shaken slightly as gasps rippled through the room and then panned to Danielle's face, still poised, dignified. The internet took it from there. Within hours, the hashtag "Respect is priceless" was trending worldwide. Danielle watched it all unfold with a mix of sorrow and clarity. She hadn't needed the world to see what happened that night, but now that they had, she knew there was no turning back. The clip didn't just vindicate her decision, it illuminated the quiet racism and institutional arrogance that people of color endured in spaces of wealth and power. And suddenly, the deal that once seemed untouchable became radioactive. Overnight, the Kingsley Corporation stock dropped by 18%, institutional investors pulling out in droves. Brand partners issued statements distancing themselves. By noon, the Kingsley PR team was in full crisis mode, scrambling to contain what was quickly becoming one of the most devastating corporate scandals in recent history. Meanwhile, in a different part of the city, Danielle remained composed. In her corner office, she met with her leadership team, calmly going over contingency plans. But what none of them expected was the avalanche of new interest pouring in. 12 major corporations, including several international giants, known for their ethical standards and progressive leadership, had already contacted her office by midday, offering partnerships that not only matched the Kingsley deal in value, but exceeded it in reputation. These companies saw in Danielle what the Kingsleys had failed to recognize: not just a powerful CEO, but a moral compassa leader who stood for something larger than quarterly earnings. Her longtime ally and VP Samantha Green burst into the room, tablet in hand, her eyes wide. Danielle Sterling, Global North Star Industries, and the Wilson Group all just sent over. In the days following Danielle Moore's powerful press conference, the business world transformed. Her words, "My dignity is not for sale," echoed across boardrooms, newsrooms, college campuses, and social media feeds worldwide. But while the public watched a storm gather over the once mighty Kingsley empire within Danielle's own company, a new current of energy surged through the halls. Employees stood taller, prouder. The woman they worked for had not only defended her own integrity, but had protected the very soul of the company they believed in. And now the world was noticing. Major firms, many who had hesitated before, now rushed to align themselves with her, not because of what she lost, but because of what she stood for. By the end of that week, Danielle sat in the same boardroom where she had declared her withdrawal from the Kingsley deal. But now she was surrounded by opportunity, not desperation. On the table before her were 3 signed partnership agreements, each one backed by globally respected companies like Sterling Global North Star Industries and the Wilson Group. Collectively, they totaled more than $1.2 billion in investment, surpassing the original Kingsley offer. But for Danielle, the true value of these deals wasn't in the zero sit, was in the shared values. These companies didn't just want her for profit. They believed in her leadership, her clarity, and her refusal to compromise under pressure. Her VP Samantha Green practically glowed as she reviewed the final documents. "I've never seen anything like this," she said, her voice hushed with awe. "It's like the entire industry is waking up." Danielle smiled softly but didn't gloat. "It's not about me. It's about the message. People are tired of trading silence for success. Maybe we just reminded them that it's possible to have both principle and power." While Danielle's company thrived, the Kingsleys faced a reckoning of their own. The viral video continued to spiral, bringing waves of public backlash and media scrutiny. Protesters gathered outside Kingsley Corp headquarters chanting, "We won't buy hate." Shareholders demanded accountability. Several long-standing partners severed ties altogether. And inside the Kingsley mansion, once a fortress of control and legacy, Brandon Kingsley was unraveling. His arrogance so firm that night at the gala had cracked under the weight of national condemnation. Even Charles Kingsley could no longer shield him. In an emergency board meeting filled with tension, the elder Kingsley delivered a final judgment. Brandon was suspended indefinitely from all leadership duties, his privileges revoked, his future uncertain. Brandon protested, of course howling, that the world had overreacted, that he was the victim of a smear campaign. But the board, once cowed by his name, had had enough. "You're not a victim," one director told him coldly. "You're the symptom." As for Danielle, she moved with grace through the chaos, not pausing for victory laps or revenge. She declined most media appearances, choosing instead to focus on realigning her company's vision around this moment. She launched an internal initiative focused on diversity, equity, and ethical leadership. She created a mentorship program for young women of color in tech. And she reinvested a portion of the new partnership funds into a startup incubator for underserved communities, quietly ensuring that her rise lifted others. The press kept asking for quotes, for headlines, for sound bites, but Danielle gave them something better, an example. And soon that example turned into legacy. 1 month later, at the Global Leadership Summit, Danielle stepped onto a stage surrounded by world leaders, entrepreneurs, and changemakers. The theme, the cost of dignity. Dressed in a simple white suit, her voice calm but powerful, Danielle shared her story not as a victim of racism or a CEO on the rise, but as a woman who made a choice. There will always be moments in life, she told the audience, when we are asked to trade a piece of ourselves for something shiny, status, approval, wealth. But remember, anything gained at the cost of your dignity isn't a victory. It's a chain. When she stepped down, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Not for the money she'd raised, not for the deals she'd won, but for the courage she had shown when it mattered most. Danielle Moore hadn't just survived a public humiliation. She'd redefined what real success looked like. And this time it didn't wear a tuxedo or carry a last name of privilege. It walked in stilettos, wore natural curls, and looked the world in the eye unapologetically. The echo of Danielle Moore's words at the Global Leadership Summit. Anything gained at the cost of your dignity isn't a victory. It's a chain, still reverberated long after she stepped off the stage. Around the world, her message rippled through boardrooms, college auditoriums, and kitchen tables. But in her own quiet corner of the city, Danielle wasn't dwelling on applause. She was back at her desk, sleeves rolled up, reviewing proposals from the ethical investment partners who now clamored to align with her company. Yet even in the face of this soaring success, Danielle remained deeply grounded. She knew this victory was not just about her. It belonged to every young Black woman who had ever been told to tone it down, every professional who'd swallowed a microaggression for the sake of keeping their job, and every entrepreneur who believed that integrity and ambition had to live in separate rooms. But not everyone was celebrating. Across town, in the now dimmed halls of the once dominant Kingsley Corporation, Brandon. Kingsley sat in silence, staring out of his office window as protesters gathered outside for the third consecutive week. The signs were brutal. Arrogance has consequences. We support more, not more hate and dignity. Dollars. Inside, the board had made it official Brandon was not only suspended, but pending a full internal review that could see him permanently removed from the company bearing his family's name. The golden elevator that once carried him to the executive floors now denied his badge access. And worse still, the man who once prided himself on being untouchable found himself completely alone. His father, Charles Kingsley, had retreated from public view, consumed by the fallout and his own bitter regret. "I always thought money would insulate us," he had told Brandon in a rare, defeated moment. "But character is what protects you." We had the former, she had the latter. Back at Danielle's company, however, the culture had shifted. Inspired by her stand, employees began speaking, up suggesting new inclusion policies, proposing ethical review boards for future partnerships, and volunteering to mentor interns from disadvantaged communities. It wasn't performative. It was real. Danielle had proven that courage could be contagious. She launched a leadership development series entitled Dignity First, and within weeks enrollment filled with young professionals hungry for a new kind of guidance, one that valued not just climbing the ladder, but knowing when to walk away from the wrong building altogether. One afternoon, as Danielle walked through the company's open-concept workspace, a young woman barely out of college approached her hesitantly. "Ms. Moore," she said, "I just wanted to say I was going to leave this industry. I didn't think there was space for someone like me, but after what you did, I'm staying. Because now I know we don't have to compromise to succeed." Danielle smiled, placing a hand gently on the young woman's shoulder. "That's the real victory," she said. "Not the headlines, not the partnerships. It's knowing that you don't have to lose yourself to win." And yet behind every camera flash and viral headline, Danielle carried the weight of what it took to get here. She remembered the sleepless nights after the Kingsley insult, the boardroom tension, the private fear that maybe she'd jeopardized everything. But she also remembered why she'd done it. Not to punish, not to posture, but to protect the most sacred currency a person can hold, their self-respect. In the weeks that followed, Danielle quietly signed additional agreements with non-profit groups focused on workplace equity and announced a new corporate policy requiring ethical conduct clauses in all major contracts. These weren't PR moves, they were the blueprint for a better kind of business. And the world was watching. As for Brandon Kingsley, he watched too, from the sidelines now, reduced from heir apparent to a cautionary tale. His smugness replaced by confusion, his certainty by silence. He had spent his life believing his last name was enough. Danielle Moore had shown him and the world that it wasn't. Because when dignity walks into a room, no amount of money can compete. That night, as Danielle stood by her office window, watching the city lights flicker below, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She thought of her grandmother, who used to say, "Child, don't ever let them make you small. Walk tall even when they try to shame you." And she had. She'd walked tall through insult, through pressure, through doubt, and emerged stronger. She hadn't just saved a company. She had reset the bar for what leadership truly means. A year later, Danielle Moore's name no longer belonged only in boardrooms. It lived in classrooms, on community banners, and in the hearts of a generation reawakened to the quiet, invincible strength of dignity. Her company had not only recovered from the storm, it had flourished. Profits were up. Retention rates soared. But more than numbers, Danielle had built something no balance sheet could quantify: trust. Her leadership had sparked a movement, one that reached far beyond the tech sector. Students, activists, even former skeptics now looked to her as a symbol that it was still possible to succeed without compromising who you are. Meanwhile, the Kingsley family continued its slow descent. Despite massive restructuring and public apologies, the damage to their brand remained. Investors had returned cautiously, but trust had not. Brandon Kingsley, once destined to inherit an empire, now worked behind closed doors on meaningless reports, his name scrubbed from company press releases. He had become a living reminder of what happens when privilege is mistaken for character. And yet Danielle carried no bitterness. In private, she often said the real work began after the headlines faded. Her focus had shifted toward mentoring, toward impact. Her new scholarship program for underrepresented youth in business launched that spring. The first class of recipients wrote her letters with stories that mirrored her own, the silent battles, the doubts, the resilience. Danielle read each one, carefully, personally, because she knew what it meant to be seen not as a symbol, but as a human being fighting to be respected. One evening, as she closed her laptop and turned out the lights in her now iconic office, Danielle stood by the window and whispered to herself, "It was never about the deal. It was always about who you become when no one's watching." And that, more than anything, was her greatest triumph. True success is not about what you earn, it's about what you refuse to sell. Dignity, self-respect, integrity. These things are not negotiable. When you choose to stand for something, even at great cost, you don't just protect yourself. You inspire others to believe they can do the same. And that ripple, it changes everything. What about you? Have you ever had to choose between what's right and what's easy? Tell us your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how you stood your ground. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful real-life narratives that prove this. When you lead with values, the world will follow.